Thank you all for coming out tonight to hear Miranda discuss Laptop from Hell, her important book on sex, drugs, money, and power. Or maybe it's depravity, corruption, and treason.
This laptop is a complete mess, like Hunter Biden's personal life. It's full of explicit porn, homemade porn with, prostitutes, the women that he was having relationships with, and anyone else. He was obsessed with every aspect of his body and his personal life, so he videotaped everything. So you have to wade through that layer. And I think that got a lot of publicity, obviously, for the prurient nature of it. I mentioned in one story about one photograph where he balances M&Ms on his penis and takes photographs of it. That got much more coverage than other, probably more important things. So I've tried to balance in the book, give a taste of that sort of prurient, depraved material that's in the laptop. But of course, far more important than that is the material that it takes a while to dig down and find, and that's, the emails, the text messages, the sort of little trail of breadcrumbs that leads you to an absolutely gobsmacking, shocking revelation. But the laptop alone is not enough. It is one piece of the jigsaw puzzle. It is buttressed by material from Tony Bobulinski, who is one of Hunter Biden's business partners, a real American patriot, a naval veteran, a hero. He came forward before the election, seeing how the New York Post, our story that we'd published 3 weeks before the election, was being buried. He came forward to corroborate it, and he handed over the material that he had on his devices to the FBI. And that material corroborated a lot of what was on the laptop, but it also augmented it with, for instance, WhatsApp messages, and where Hunter and his partners were a lot more free and easy about what they said. And then the other piece of the jigsaw puzzle is some really excellent work done by 2 Republican senators who were traduced as, Kremlin operatives, that's just the Democrats' go-to, is they regard or they pretend that their opponents are Russian propagandists. That was Chuck Grassley and Ron Johnson, and they conducted a terrific, very exhaustive investigation into one aspect of the corruption to do with Ukraine and this corrupt energy company, Burisma, that was paying Hunter Biden $83,000 a month to sit on its board. Well, the one moment that really had me reel away from the laptop and just have to go for a walk and just shake my head and think, I cannot believe I've seen this. And it was only possible really with the Bobulinski mixing those up. And that was the biggest deal that Hunter Biden and his uncle Jim Biden had done so far with the Chinese. Now, they were joint venture partners with a energy company in China called CEFC. But it wasn't just an energy company. This was the capitalist arm of President Xi's Belt and Road Initiative, which of course is China's imperialist push into the rest of the world. And the biggest deal that CEFC was going to do was with Russia. And Vladimir Putin, shades of today, had been pushed into a corner by European sanctions on Russia after the downing of MH17, that Malaysian Airlines flight over Ukraine. And he then was forced into the arms of President Xi, who, is an expansionist leader. And President Xi decided that he was going to buy a big chunk of Rosneft, which is the Russian state-owned energy company. So this was a marriage of China and Russia. Disastrous for America. It's now happening again. But it didn't happen because President Trump came into office and he had assigned Attorney General then Jeff Sessions to disrupt China's sort of business invasion of America. And so very quickly, one of his business partners was arrested at JFK. The boss of CEFC was disappeared in China, and that deal for China to buy Rosneft suddenly fell apart, and China had to pay Russia, I think, $10 million in compensation. So that was a close call. But that was this crackhead son of Joe Biden couldn't tie his shoelaces, could not conduct his personal life in any normal fashion. He was out of it most of the time. He was had a raging crack addiction, a raging sex, porn, prostitute addiction. His personal life was in disarray. He was fighting with everyone. And this guy and his bumbling Uncle Jim, Joe Biden's younger brother, were right in the heart of the biggest deal, this geopolitical landmine that was going to be so detrimental to America's national security. They were right in the heart of it. They were joint venture partners and were going to benefit enormously. And on top of that, Joe Biden was the 10% partner. That was the 10% for the big guy deal. And Joe Biden was going to, when he finished being vice president, Hunter Biden had already made up a nameplate in DC in a building called, I think, the Swedish House. They had an office in there, and on the door was going to be Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, CEFC America, the Belt and Road Initiative, America's, the American version, and that was Joe Biden, future president, former vice president, was there, and it just fell apart because of Donald Trump. But now we're back at square one again.
You have your source is the president's son. You have him in his own words. You have essentially all the correspondence, everyone who is emailing him, these videos. It was just an amazing amount of access that, for people who try to keep, usually try to keep the media at bay.
The reason that it's important is not about Hunter Biden, who's a 52-year-old, a supposedly reformed drug addict. That's his personal life. Who cares? That's often what people... Sure. Attack me and say, why are you, delving into ruining his privacy and so on. It's not about Hunter Biden. It's about Joe Biden. Joe Biden is at the top of this family business. He is the product they are selling, and he is intimately involved. He is directing it. He is introducing Hunter to the important people at the top of the Russian or the Chinese or the Ukrainian or the Romanian or the Kazakhstani hierarchy that is going to give him the money. Because in China, for instance, when Hunter Biden got off Air Force One in 2013 with his father, to Chinese eyes, it was obvious what was happening. Hunter Biden was a princeling. In China, in these corrupt countries, you don't give the money to the top official. You give it to their children or their family member. And in China, these sons and daughters of the privileged are called princelings. So the American journalists on Air Force Two for that trip with Joe Biden saw nothing peculiar about his middle-aged son coming along and being introduced to all the higher-ups at the CCP, for Joe Biden to be shaking the hand of Hunter Biden's new Chinese business partner who tipped him into this enormous deal, this firm that he was given a 10% stake in for nothing, and that ended up, in 2019, it had $2.5 billion worth of funds under management. And the other thing is that from the laptop, we know that Joe Biden financially benefited personally from Hunter Biden's business deals. So we don't have a lot, but there is a little bit, and it's very damning, and that is that there were shared bank accounts, there were shared debit cards, and there was also some evidence of that Hunter Biden was actually paying the household bills for Joe Biden. There was a monthly AT&T phone bill, just a couple $100, but there were also some evidence of bills for maintenance on his mansion, one of his mansions in Delaware. So, a retaining wall being fixed, some painting, some shutters being repaired. And it only came to light because the Bidens apparently are notorious around Delaware for not paying their bills, because to the local tradesman it's supposed to be such an honour to work for Joe Biden that, you know, you wouldn't want to let money get in the way. But some of these tradesmen were pressing to get their bills paid. I mean, they were $3,000-4,000 each. It's a lot to a small tradesman. So these bills were maybe 9 months old, and it came to the surface. That was how it arrived in the laptop. Well, I guess it's like the Durham investigation. There really have been very few leaks from this investigation into Hunter Biden's business affairs. There's another one going on into his Uncle Jim. Tax evasion, we know that they're looking at that because Hunter Biden told us himself after the election, but also supposedly they're looking at money laundering and some sort of foreign agent registration stuff. So, I mean, if they want to, there are multiple crimes that you can find on the laptop. So what we know so far is that in May 2019, which was a few weeks after Joe Biden announced his candidacy for president, this grand jury, or the US Attorney David Weiss in Delaware, subpoenaed JP Morgan Chase Bank for bank transactions to do with Hunter Biden, Jim Biden, and two of Hunter's business partners, Devon Archer and Eric Schwerin. And specifically, they asked for anything to do with the Bank of China. Now, I know from the laptop and from Bob Linsky's material, there's a lot of that Chinese money sloshed through tens of millions of dollars. So they're getting that. Now, they're one of the names on one of these suspicious activity reports from JP Morgan Chase that I've seen is a woman called Zoe Keston. And she was an I don't know if you'd call her a girlfriend, but a woman who spent a long time with Hunter at Chateau Marmont in Hollywood when he went on one of his months-long crack benders in 2018 after he got a big payout from China. And she testified before the grand jury and apparently talked about his wild spending sprees, because that 2018 in particular, he was, you know, staying at Chateau Marmont. He had his drug addiction was incredible, prostitutes, you know, several times a day, and he had drug dealers parading through the hotel room who were stealing everything in sight, and he was cooking crack, and he kept on having his laptops and his phones and his wallet stolen, and you know, it was a very expensive several months bender for him. And you know, we have a president whose family has been paid money from Russian oligarchs at the right hand of Vladimir Putin. Not just money, you know, one transaction was $3.5 million that went into the bank account of one of Hunter's business partners in America. And, you know, the money that he was getting from Ukraine, another Russia-aligned oligarch was in charge of that company, Burisma, the owner of that company. Now, he was a former energy minister of the former Russia-aligned government who was paying Hunter Biden this $1 million a year payment. And Joe Biden was warned about that several times by some sort of mid-level State Department officials and ignored that. One of them buttonholed him on Air Force Two on the way to Ukraine. One of them came into his office. And so there's just been no accountability here. The American media, the establishment, the prestige media of the New York Times, the Washington Post and so on, they blocked it. Big Tech censored the story, and you had people like John Brennan and other, you know, former security and intelligence operatives who then gave the fig leaf to Joe Biden that the laptop was Russian disinformation. So the American people were kept in the dark before the election, and the proper due diligence they were not able to do on one of the candidates for president. I think that Trump just changed everything. You know, journalists at those organisations that I mentioned just decided to throw out every, you know, ancient aspect of journalistic ethics, because the means justified the end. You know, they had to get rid of Donald Trump. Didn't matter who Joe Biden was. He could have been the devil incarnate, and they were going to ensure that he won. Because there's competition, obviously, and we had the laptop and they didn't. So ignoring it was kind of a normal competitive instinct, I suppose, although you'd think they'd try and find their own copy of the laptop. But no, what actually surprised me was Facebook and Twitter, how brazen they were at just displaying their power. You know, to the New York Post is the 4th largest newspaper in the country. It's the oldest newspaper in the country. And they took it on themselves a couple of hours after our first story was published to censor it. Twitter blocked the New York Post's account for 2 weeks, until a few days before the election. And, you know, a little while after that, they deplatformed the sitting president of the United States. It was just a lie, and it was all done for partisan purposes to make sure that Donald Trump didn't win the election. And that's terrifying. And we know that it made, you know, a material difference to the outcome of the election, because there was a poll done by the Media Research Centre, and they found that about half of Biden voters had no idea about this scandal or the laptop or anything. And 10% of them, if they had known, would have changed their vote. And this is an election decided by 45,000 votes in a handful of battleground states, so that could have made a difference. But we're seeing with the Durham report that, you know, good things are happening. And then, of course, if the Republicans win back the House and the Senate, they have said, or some of them have said, that they will be holding proper inquiries and they'll have the subpoena power and so on to call people like Hunter Biden, but many others, to testify about what they know about this corrupt influence peddling operation. But, you know, the Bidens aren't the only people that have done this. I think Joe Biden is a master of it. In Washington, he's been doing it for decades.
One thing I thought was really interesting, and I'm really glad that you put it in the book, was about his teeth.
Oh, yeah.
Because he was a heavy drug user and a crack user, and as many of you know, when you use drugs like that, it does affect the teeth. So I thought that was interesting. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, it was one of the most arresting photos in there was Hunter, I can't remember the exact number, I think it was like $80,000 that he spent at a dentist called Smiles on 57th Street in Midtown in New York. And there it's a sort of before and after photo. So there's a photo of him smiling with these peg teeth, awful yellow, hollowed down teeth. And then afterwards, if you notice now, he's always flashing the pearly whites. Just like Joe Biden. Joe Biden had his teeth fixed, and he had his hair plugs and the Botox and the whole thing. So Hunter has learned from his dad that teeth are extremely important.
My question is about the new Mrs. Hunter Biden, a South African young Cohen, I think her name is. How is that relationship proceeding? And I'm also curious about the baby mama. She's been testifying, I understand, right?
Yes, the baby mama, it was a former stripper called London Roberts, who actually was working at an establishment not far from here. And when Hunter was... Gentleman's Club, yes. And Hunter was nothing but a gentleman when he was there. And so London Roberts, anyway, became pregnant and had 3 years ago had Hunter's 4th child. So Hunter, though, denied that it was his child. And in fact, in his memoir, Beautiful Things, he claims that he can't even remember. He says must have been just one encounter. He can never remember meeting her. That's not true, because the laptop shows that he knew her very well for a very long time. He used to smuggle her into his office building at Swedish House through the back fire door. and over months. And when he was challenged by the building managers, because there's 2 consulates in the building and they were concerned about security issues, he wrote this very long 1,000-word sort of rant at them and thought he was very clever, and said, no, this woman, London Roberts, gave her entire CV, said she was the basketball coach to his daughter and also to Sasha, I think, Obama, who was his daughter's friend, so dropping the Obama name. And so he knew her extremely well, and she was actually on his payroll at one point. So she had the baby. She had to sue him for paternity. The DNA proved that it was his child. But in his book, on the jacket, in his little biography, he talks about being the father of 3 girls, but doesn't mention the 4th child. So London Roberts, I suppose, is a little bit miffed. So she did appear at the grand jury last Tuesday and testified for several hours. And Hunter has been, you know, a little bit silent lately. I mean, he was, I don't know if you noticed, but he was at the White House a lot. And in fact, there so much in the early months that that Joe had built for him, his son, his 2-year-old little boy, a swing set on the grounds of the White House, which you can see when Joe's walking back from Marine One to his office. And and we know that Hunter is basically Joe's, no kidding, as Joe would say, his number one or closest, most trusted advisor. Because Hunter Biden is actually very intelligent. I didn't believe this, but I was told this by one of Hunter's many therapists. And when I really was fair about it and read his emails and his long missives to himself, he's quite a good writer. Anyway, I think that he's concerned at the moment because the grand jury is starting to, it seems to be accelerating, starting to bring people in from his personal life and ask them questions. And the other problem for him is that his best friend in business, a guy called Devin Archer, who had been a Yale colleague of his, is going to be sentenced on Monday, I think I mentioned, in the Southern District of New York, for this serious criminal fraud of one of the poorest Indian tribes in America.
And the new Mrs. Hunter?
The new Mrs. Hunter, so her name is Melissa Cohen. They did meet at Chateau Marmont. He was introduced to her by somebody he met around the pool, and they fell madly in love that night. You know, if there was pedophilia, if he was a pedophile, that is the worst crime of all. Everything else that's on the laptop would, you know, just pale into insignificance. And so, of course, I would have concentrated on that. But there's no evidence of it. And in fact, I mean, I have seen much more of Hunter Biden's sex life than I would like to have seen. But everything I have seen is that he is a heterosexual who likes women of his own age. You know, women, you know, the prostitutes are in their 20s. And there's no evidence that he has any peculiar sexual preferences.
Yeah. Well, that may be an appropriate place to end.